Hi, everybody. A very happy new year and a very happy new podcast season for our many listeners that have spent the last few years with me. And I guess what we would call the first iteration of this podcast, which until very recently was called the Crime Lab Coachcast and focused strictly on forensic science, laboratories, forensic science in general, and the use of forensic evidence in our criminal justice system. And for those of you who have been with me on this journey today, January 20th, 2025, a very chilly day throughout most of the country, we begin the next chapter in the evolution of our podcast with the first episode of Crime in the Courtroom. And as I was reflecting on the best way for me to really get started out the right way with this first reformatted episode and to help both our new listeners and our existing listeners understand what the show is all about, I decided that I wanted to accomplish a few important things. I need to honor and commemorate the world that I come from, which is very important to me, the forensic laboratory sciences. And I need this episode to be a sample of what we hope to focus on in the coming years by expanding our content beyond just forensic science and into the broader realm of criminal justice and public safety while maintaining our interest and prioritization of forensic science and forensic evidence along the way. And that makes sense because in a lot of ways, forensic science is a barometer for how well a criminal jurisdiction is doing its job. And we'll talk more about that in future episodes. To wrap up this brief introduction, I also think it's important that in this first episode of Crime in the Courtroom, that I include an encouraging and hopefully impactful coaching perspective, one that is based on current or past events that are taking place in our criminal justice system. But in doing that, I really want to tap into my own real life experiences and stories from my career in criminal justice or those of my guests. And like the crazy story I'm going to be telling you today, they will often be very entertaining and thought provoking. But even more important than that is that they will hopefully empower you as a criminal justice professional in whatever capacity you serve: a police officer, a police commander, a prosecutor, a defender, a forensic expert, a judge, a student, a journalist, an educator. Whatever it is you do, we want these lessons to enable each of us to make our own powerful individual contributions to the betterment of our criminal justice system, and to do so by prioritizing the betterment of ourselves and the agencies that we represent. Excellence always begins with the individual, and that is you and that is me. So today, I want to share with you the true story of the craziest case I ever experienced in a forensic science laboratory and why it meant so much to me and how it really changed my understanding of law enforcement, my appreciation for the risks involved in modern day policing, but also to explore a specific opportunity that police agencies have to strengthen their organizational cultures and reinforce the professional processes, developmental processes, if you will, that ensure that newly promoted police leaders or commanders use their rank, stature, and authority to lead the right way with the right intentions so that they produce the right results. So here we go. The story I am about to tell you probably happened in late 1995 or early 1996, although I don't remember the exact date. I was working as a forensic firearm examiner in the headquarters laboratory of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation in Decatur, which is just to the east of downtown Atlanta. It was very common for us in the firearms unit to respond immediately to police officer-involved shootings in which the officer fired her or his weapon in the line of duty, regardless of whether or not anyone was actually hit or hurt or killed. So unlike what you see in the movies, It is a very big deal when an officer discharges a firearm in public. It's a big deal when anyone discharges a firearm in public, even when it's justified or in self-defense. Police officers, however, are not permitted to discharge their firearm in public unless it is absolutely necessary to save a life. And when they do, there are a lot of administrative and legal reviews that take place to make sure that the discharge of the firearm was justified. So, as a forensic scientist specializing in firearms, I was one of the examiners who would receive an officer's gun at the laboratory, test fire the firearm into a specially designed water tank, retrieve the bullets, and then conduct a full examination to make sure the firearm was in good working condition, meaning that the officer couldn't falsely claim that the gun just went off without the trigger being pulled, because we can test for that. And then, of course, we would provide a written laboratory report of our findings to the officer's agency for their records. And I should point out that, having worked many police shootings during my career, I never examined an officer's gun and found that it was not in proper working condition, except for one time. I remember that it was around lunchtime, and we got word that an officer was involved in a shooting near Atlanta. We also knew that a single perpetrator fired at least one shot at the officer. We knew that the officer survived, but that the officer reported experiencing a malfunction of his semi-automatic pistol during the exchange, and that he wasn't even certain that he fired his gun, which I have to admit seemed rather suspicious to me at the time. An evidence technician brought the firearm to the laboratory, where it was entered into evidence and then taken into possession by me for analysis. So my goal was to get the firearm test fired and analyzed as quickly as possible, so that the officer could be returned, or that the gun could be returned to the officer and put back into service once the officer was put back into service, which can sometimes take a bit of time as the standard necessary reviews are completed, and to make sure that the officer has recovered emotionally from the stress of the experience. As I was trained to do, and as I did in this case, I reviewed the police report, which included statements made by the officer about what happened. But I quickly realized that something wasn't adding up. According to the report submitted to me with the firearm, the officer seemed genuinely confused about whether or not he actually fired his gun, which again was very unusual and sort of difficult to even believe. You know, how do you not know whether you fired your gun or not? You pull the trigger, it goes bang, you feel your hand absorb the force of the recoil, you fired your gun, period. It's not very complicated. When I opened the evidence box that the firearm was in, I saw one semi-automatic pistol with its slide pulled and locked back into a safe position. And I saw a fully loaded magazine, meaning that it was loaded to capacity. And there was one unfired cartridge secured with tape to the inside of the box. Now, for those of you who may not be experienced in the basic use of firearms, when police officers load their pistols, they will often load the magazine to capacity, insert it into the grip frame, charge and release the slide to strip a cartridge from the magazine into the chamber, then remove the magazine and add one more cartridge to the magazine to replace the one that is now in the chamber. So hopefully that makes sense. So you have a fully loaded magazine plus one cartridge in the chamber ready to fire. And it was also noteworthy that no fired or discharged cartridge cases were submitted for analysis, which was usually the case in a situation like this. So because we had an empty firearm one loaded magazine, one unfired cartridge taped to the inside of the box, and no spent cartridge cases. It was actually looking as if the officer did not fire his firearm during the incident, at least preliminarily, from my vantage point in the laboratory. So I removed the firearm and the magazine from the box and did a quick double check to make sure the chamber was empty. I depressed the slide release to put the gun into battery, as we say, which means that the slide goes all the way forward and the hammer or firing pin is left in the cocked position. So if the gun was actually loaded, it would now fire once the trigger was pulled. But again, there was something wrong. When I released the slide, it didn't go all the way forward as it should have. It was getting hung up on something, and because it wasn't going all the way forward, its own internal safety mechanisms would not allow a pull of the trigger to release the hammer. This is called being out of battery, and this is a common safety feature in semi-automatic firearms. So I pulled the slide back again, and I released it again, and the same thing happened. The slide, under a lot of spring tension, snapped forward, but it got hung up and did not go into battery. It's kind of like your refrigerator door not closing all the way because a carton of milk is sticking out too far on the shelf, right? And unless I could figure this out, I wasn't going to be able to test fire the gun. So clearly something was wrong, and now the officer's confusion was starting to make a little bit of sense to me because I was confused and I wasn't experiencing the stress of an armed encounter with a suspect. As someone who is right-handed, when I was examining an empty firearm in the laboratory, I would generally hold the pistol so that the left side of the pistol was facing upward and the barrel was pointing to my left or kind of forward and to my left. So this means that the right side of the pistol would be facing down toward the work surface and away from my view. So in my effort to figure out what was wrong, I turned the right side of the pistol upward so that I could see it. And as I looked toward the muzzle end of the slide, I noticed that there was a small amount of damage to both the slide and the barrel, right at the muzzle where the bullet would exit when fired. So the barrel sits within the slide, for those who may not be familiar. In fact, upon closer look, you could see that the barrel was slightly bent and dented, and it was preventing the slide from traveling all the way forward so that the gun could go into battery and be fired as it's designed to do. But there was something about this damage that seriously stopped me in my tracks, and I wish I could have seen the look on my face when I recognized it. The damage to the slide had a coating of what appeared to be smeared copper that could clearly be seen with the naked eye, and then even more clearly with a microscope. As some of you know, bullets are often constructed of a lead core that is seated within or coated with what's called a copper jacket that wraps around the core. And so I immediately could tell what most likely happened and why the officer was so confused. So the officer in this case engaged with an armed suspect. The suspect was pointing his gun at the officer, and the officer was pointing his gun at the suspect. Both men, the officer and the suspect, pulled the triggers of their guns. But it was clear that the suspect pulled his trigger first, and here's how I knew. And please try to follow me on this because it's really interesting and it's really disturbing at the same time because of how close to death this officer came. Just before the officer pulled his trigger, the bullet from the suspect's gun hit the muzzle end of the officer's gun, damaging the slide and pushing it rearward out of battery. And because the barrel and slide were ever so slightly damaged due to the impact, the spring tension from the gun's mainspring could not push the officer's slide back into battery. In other words, the impact disabled the officer's gun just milliseconds before he attempted to fire it. So when he pulled the trigger, the gun would not fire, yet he would have felt the force of the impact from the suspect's bullet hitting his gun, which understandably confused him. He probably thought it was his own recoil that he felt, but he also probably sensed that the trigger didn't feel right because it was disengaged from the firing mechanism. You can't train for a scenario like this in the police academy. Now, to appreciate how dangerous this situation was, think about where officers are holding their guns when firing them. Okay, they're holding it up on a line of sight that runs directly from the target through the sights of the gun to the officer's dominant eye, meaning that the suspect's bullet was heading right for the officer's head when it struck the muzzle end of his gun. I had never seen anything like it and never have since. It was unbelievable. But the forensic evidence told the story very clearly. So in the end, fortunately, the suspect fled the scene and did not fire another shot, and the incident was over, leaving the officer confused about what happened, but fortunately safe and alive. The officer in this case, I would say, was in his late 20s or early 30s, and when he came to the laboratory to pick up his gun, I had already spoken to someone at his office about what I found and that the firearm would have to be repaired before it could be put back into service. And I will never forget the look on the officer's face. In fact, let me correct myself. I will never forget the absence of any look on the officer's face. It looked like he had literally seen a ghost, as they say, and he could hardly speak to me. And the only thing I could bring myself to say to him was, "I'm really glad to be talking to you right now." And so I handed him a bag with his firearm in it, and as he went to shake my hand, with a blank, numb sort of expression on his face, he said, "So am I." And that was it. He left. I never saw him again. Unbelievable that he survived. Now, obviously, I'm telling this story for a reason, and it's my intent to use this experience as a way to explore a couple significant lessons about modern day law enforcement agencies, and also a significant lesson for us in society who depend on our police officers to keep us safe, while they also endure the risks to which they are constantly exposed. So let's start there first, if that's okay with you. And I'm going to be very direct here. Communities that employ police officers should be ashamed of themselves when they tolerate and in some instances enable the very threats that make policing a dangerous profession. And this is a pervasive, disturbing problem in our society. It's not good enough to just say, "Thank you for your service," to our police officers out there, or to confront their surviving spouses and children when they're killed in the line of duty. We have a responsibility as citizens to do what we can do to make policing safer. It's up to us. It really is. The safety of our police officers is our responsibility to a large degree. So policing becomes safer as an occupation when we raise our children right, when we give them the love and support they need, when we teach our kids the right kinds of values, when we become more effective at recognizing and dealing with serious mental and emotional disturbances before they become a threat, when we invest in certain kinds of technologies that both protect officers and deter violence, when we suppress the trafficking of drugs and illegal guns into vulnerable communities, when we get aggressive with gangs and other criminal entities that have no regard for people's welfare, and this is really important and not to be dismissed, when we do a better job at communicating to our police commanders that we expect them to lead their agencies in a skillful and thoughtful way. We should expect that our police chiefs, our directors of state police, our directors of public safety, our federal law enforcement authorities, and our county sheriffs enable organizational cultures that allow officers to feel good about their work and feel supported by those they are protecting and those that are leading them. Few things are worse for a police officer on the street, in my opinion, than having to cope with the inherent risks of the job while also having to cope with commanders who just don't seem up to the challenge, who just don't seem to understand what true leadership is really about. And that final point leads me to the second lesson that I want to spend a bit of time on before we close this episode. A term that you hear a lot in law enforcement circles is command and control. Command and control. And part of the command and control mentality is to train and condition officers to be loyal to the fraternity, loyal to the hierarchy, to know your place and to behave as if you know your place. And by the way, there's a really good reason for that, not the least of which is the incident that I just shared with you a moment ago, teaching and conditioning police officers to comply with rules and regulations, to follow orders, follow the law, execute the tactical techniques and methods that they're trained to execute when necessary, and to be loyal and differential to your commanders makes it more likely that those officers will not only survive the most dangerous situations, but also makes them more effective at de-escalating serious threats when they emerge. And if you don't mind the little plug here, as I wrote in my book, The New Superior, A Better Way to Be the One in Charge, hierarchy and conformance have great value when survival is the priority. Let me just say that one more time so it sinks in. This is really important. Hierarchy and conformance have great value when survival is the priority. But here is the catastrophic problem that I have encountered and continue to encounter in my criminal justice career, including in my work as a professional coach who works with police commanders and other criminal justice professionals. One of the most traumatic events to occur in the lives and careers of many police officers is not being shot at. It's not being shot at. It's not pulling over a vehicle on a busy interstate. It's being promoted into a position of management. And that is not an exaggeration. It is among the most confusing, alarming, traumatic, and disorienting experiences many police officers will ever go through. And there are varying reasons why it's so traumatic, especially when you get above the sergeant level and are more likely to be working in an office environment. The inability to relax those hierarchical paramilitary reflexes and tendencies has a devastating impact on a commander's ability to cultivate teamwork. It destroys teamwork. Now, obviously, those reflexes and tendencies have great value in a tactical environment or survival situations, as I explained a moment ago, where there is the presence of a clear threat. But this is not what you have in an office. This is not what you have when you are sharing a pleasant moment with a respectful citizen. This is not what you have at a homeowners association meeting or a school classroom. This is not what you have at a city council meeting. This is not what you have when you are in a staff meeting in a nice, safe conference room. The command and control mentality, when it lacks balance and self-awareness, will crush people's sense of autonomy and creativity and will therefore crush the ability of that commander to enable teamwork and individual effectiveness at scale, which is when dysfunction starts to take hold in a police organization. If if you are a police commander, you must keep in mind that competent, educated, thoughtful professionals who are made to feel inferior or feel like they are being forced to sacrifice their own dignity, their own sense of self-worth, and their own sense of personal autonomy at the altar of an egotistical police commander with a will-conditioned superiority complex will not be able to fully commit. They will not be able to show loyalty. They won't. They can't. They will protest through their disengagement and other forms of behavior that might seem troubling or disruptive. I do know for a fact that there are some wonderful, thoughtful, and very effective police commanders out there who understand exactly what I'm saying because they were able to figure it out in their own way, how to make this transition from the field to the office. But still, way too many who have high levels of rank work in an office environment but behave with really offensive and destructive hierarchical control habits. And guess what happens then? In their own way, they enable offensive behaviors out in public because they set such a bad example for the officers that are out in the field. If I'm an officer out in the field and I see people with classical command and control, hierarchical attitudes being promoted into positions of leadership, you can bet that I'll be more likely to exhibit those same kinds of attitudes and behaviors with the residents of the neighborhoods and communities I'm supposed to be serving. As certain as I am sitting here speaking with you right now, I can tell you with 100% confidence that toxic hierarchical attitudes are the number one threat preventing police commanders from creating more healthy, supportive, and encouraging cultures for both their officers and also their many civilian employees who work in a supporting role, as I did as a forensic laboratory scientist. So, returning back to my story, I remember the face of that officer when I had to return his gun to him. I remember what that felt like, and I remember feeling genuinely grateful that he was still alive because I knew darn well that just that morning there was a bullet heading straight for his head. The reason he was alive was certainly because of a lot of luck, but also because he knew how to conduct himself in that kind of a situation. And his training and the habits he was conditioned to put into action kept him alive. But I also wonder what kind of support he received in the days and weeks after I returned his gun to him. I wonder if he was supported, if there were people in positions of authority that actually cared about his emotional state and had the sensitivity and thoughtfulness to make sure he dealt with the memories of that experience and having had such a close brush with death in a way that would allow him to heal and move forward with his career. You know, simply saying, suck it up, buttercup, doesn't take any talent, doesn't take any leadership talent, doesn't take any understanding of human psychology, it doesn't take any empathy. And it's not the kind of nuanced interpersonal connectivity we'd want to apply in a situation like this. Command and control just won't cut it in that kind of a situation, just like it doesn't cut it in most situations playing out within police agencies today. Look, command and control has its place, without question. But there are aspects to the profession of law enforcement that require more advanced skills and sensibilities, and when they are missing, It is destructive to the agency, its mission, and its employees, all of them, including its officers, that are trying so hard to keep all of us safe in our homes, our neighborhoods, and our communities. So I want to share a professional coaching perspective on this. And I want to make sure I inject a good dose of encouragement as I do, because these issues are really challenging. They really are. One of the most powerful things that can be done to help police agencies become more effective in the building and maintaining of healthy organizational cultures is to provide heavy doses of mindset and attitude training, mentoring, facilitated self-analysis, and facilitated self-reflection, delivered at that critical moment when a police officer begins to transition into a position of leadership. And during this transition, classical classroom training just won't hit the mark on its own. It can't. Newly promoted officers should be coached to learn the skills that are needed to continuously strike the right balance between hierarchical loyalty and the need for commanders to know how to be an equal in the moment, as I explain in The New Superior. Because it is in positioning oneself as an equal in the moment that a leader in any capacity and at any level of rank or stature is able to earn the trust of the people that he or she is leading. And that is exactly what it takes to create the conditions in which an organization can function as much more than just a hierarchy. It can function as a team. I would rather that my friends, my family, my community, and my audience, which is all of you and your families and your communities, be protected by effective, skilled law enforcement teams rather than just loyal police hierarchies. And that's my coaching perspective for today as we bring our episode to a close. I do want to encourage all of our listeners, especially my colleagues out there and my friends in the forensic science laboratories, please share your stories with me. I know that you too have some really interesting, sometimes shocking stories to tell that we can all learn from. I want to know about it. So please shoot me an email at john@criticalvictories.com. That's john@criticalvictories.com, and let me know what stories and experiences you have had that might expand our professional skills, knowledge, and abilities. And don't be shy, please. If there is something we can learn from you, please use this show as an opportunity to share your story and the lessons you learned from it. And also, please get in touch with me if you have any questions, comments, or topics that you'd like me to cover on the show. Thank you so much for joining me, everyone, for the inaugural edition of Crime in the Courtroom. Please share these episodes with anyone you think may benefit from these unique perspectives on the effectiveness and fairness of our criminal justice system. And remember that you can visit criticalvictories.com/podcast to sign up for our newsletters that go out after each episode. Until next time, I'm John Collins signing off for now. Please remember how much you are respected and appreciated for the work you do each and every day to protect and preserve the quality of life and the duration of life of our lives here in the United States of America. Have a great rest of your day, everyone, and I will see you next time for another edition of Crime in the Courtroom. Take care.